So we'll just kick off. Obviously, we've just experienced some very significant weather events in Nelson. So will the floods and what's happened reprioritise your focus going into council?
I think certainly to a degree the recovery has to be a key focus, but still underpinning that is the same challenges we already knew we were facing: the housing crisis, improving our transport systems, introducing more resiliency and addressing climate change. If anything, those challenges have just been further highlighted, and that need for building community resilience is just even clearer now. So I think with it, the key is through that recovery, still keeping those core issues at the heart of that and addressing them at the same time as we rebuild and recalibrate.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you mentioned quite a few things there, but what do you think is the biggest challenge facing Nelson in the next 5 years? And what do you think council's role should be in helping with that?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of challenges, as I just alluded to, but also our economic challenges, the productivity hole, attracting young workers back to fill a lot of the vacancies that we're seeing, supporting that COVID recovery. But I still think that underpinning all of that is our housing crisis. We know that it's one of the biggest barriers right now to talent attraction. We know that it's hurting our people locally, but also that it's in delivering greater housing supply is also key to creating an urban environment that is resilient and can address climate change through its design. So I think that really that focus on creating compact, dense built environments with high quality, secure and affordable housing for our people is going to be the biggest challenge and biggest focus that's needed over the next 5 years.
And how do you think, what do you think council's role is in that specifically? Because that's it's a big, and there are lots of players, but what do you think council can do?
Yeah, so historically councils have sort of blamed central government for the crisis, but I think that's really, we need to take a hard look and acknowledge that actually it was councils that have consistently underzoned land and failed to be an enabler in that space. So our role is sort of multifaceted in that it's both being enabling but also leading some of that development. We've got a whole lot of underutilised council land in very central locations, which we should be looking at partnering with developers and with community housing providers to open up supply in that space. Whilst also I'd like to see us create an urban regeneration agency to help package land together, to partner with developers, to lead really high quality intensification and serve as a catalyst for the sort of broader vision that we want to see in our city.
Because that public-private partnership in theory always sounds really good, and for some reason in practice it's not always easy to deliver on. Do you have any new ways of thinking around that?
Yeah, so I think one of the key challenges is councils move slowly. We might not like that, and there are things we can do to change that, but on the whole they'll always move slower than private enterprise. And so that's where the creation of a CCO, something that can be more flexible but still able to partner and bring council's resources and knowledge to the table, is really the key to making those sorts of partnerships work. Because we know that just leaving it to the private market isn't going to deliver affordable housing necessarily, but through that partnership, that's where we can start to see the kind of results and outcomes that we want.
And so that leads sort of slightly onto my next question, which is council is often perceived by businesses to be a bit of a handbrake. How do you see that you can change that, either the reality of that, and so that council becomes that enabler for businesses?
Yeah, so there's sort of two parts to this. One is our regulatory team being under-resourced and understaffed, and that's where you see very long wait times for consenting and for those kinds of processes. And that's a tricky one to fix, because just like every business in Nelson, we're struggling with talent attraction, we're struggling to retain staff. And so that's about, one, addressing those city-wide issues, but also creating an internal culture that's attractive and people want to work in. And the other one is taking a really hard look at the regulations that we currently have in place and saying, which ones are still fit for use and which ones are actually out of date and not delivering to the outcomes that they want. I think we need when we look at regulations, we need to be really making sure that their intended outcome is their outcome, because for a lot of them, great intention has gone into them, but the actual practical results of what they're delivering isn't in line with that intention. So I think reviewing those and having those conversations and being willing to say, not being a stonewall of, well, this is what's in place, going, okay, how can we make this work better? How can we deliver to the outcomes we want whilst also making it easier and more positive to do business with council?
And that sort of also, you touched on this again in your answer slightly, but just to expand on a bit, the council culture has recently come under quite a lot of scrutiny, and you talked about the council struggling to retain and attract talent. How do you, if you are elected as mayor, how would you see that role in I guess creating a culture that would ensure that experienced staff don't leave and that you can still attract the people you need?
Yeah, so there's the two aspects of culture, the organisational culture and then the culture around the council table, and they do interact quite a fair bit. So as mayor around that council table, I think it's about leading with open and honest conversations and actually building that sense of, here's someone who any councillor or any member of the community can come and talk to with their issues and can work it through in a constructive way, not getting down that sort of slippery slope into just destructive and petty politicking and back and forth. And then within the council itself, the organisation, I think what's really needed is just a key internal focus of actually, it's very easy to stay focused on the deliverables and what's we're giving to the community, but our council is also in charge of making sure that the organisation can deliver. And so I'd like to see, particularly within our committee structure, a greater focus on how do we lift our internal processes to get those outcomes. And with that obviously comes creating a culture that is reactive to and responsive to new ideas, but also dynamic enough to deal with unforeseen challenges. And that's going to be a long process, most likely. You don't change culture overnight, but there's also great examples in other councils of where, with the right kind of leadership and the right approach, it has happened relatively quickly.
Yeah, and it's not a quick task, is it? Just getting to quite a specific question now, and we've talked a bit about this before, but council recently voted against setting up a holding company for the jointly owned assets of Tasman District and Nelson City Council. Is that something that you would revisit? And what would need to change for you actually to support that?
Yeah, so I was one of the people who voted against that, and the reason being I didn't think that in its current structure it was future focused enough. It felt like quite a internal change and basically a revenue saving or cost saving measure for those companies, instead of taking a look at what a holding company can be and what it is in other local bodies around the country, which is, yes, a sort of a holding company for council-owned companies, but also a forward-looking organisation that looks for opportunity and innovation and isn't limited just to what it starts as, but has that potential to grow and to really invest throughout the city. And that's what I'm looking for, is just, instead of sort of treading water, actually looking to the horizon, going, this can be something that really works if we get it right. But if we get it wrong, it can be something that is a liability.
And so what do you, sort of within that, what do you think is council's role then in economic development? How do you see council fitting into that whole landscape? Yeah,
so obviously we're one of the largest employers in the region, but we're also one of the largest investors. So making sure that we're capitalising investment, bringing in particularly central government funding into the region, but also supporting. We've got the wonderful project Kokiri 2.0, that economic regeneration plan, which outlines a whole lot of partners to work with, and I think that that's really key for council and economic development, is that, you know, on our own we can't do it, and we'll never be successful doing it alone. It is about forming those partnerships, and we've got the regional development agency, we've got the chamber, we've got these organisations that are already set up and a lot closer to the ground on a lot of these issues, so working with them to ensure that where we're investing and how we're investing it is maximising the return for residents.
And so on investment, where do you stand on the library precinct and investment in that?
Yeah, so with the library, I think we've got the cart before the horse, in that we've gone out with this very large price tag with no real sense for what's in it. But as a principle of using civic and social investment as a catalyst for broader regeneration, that's a concept that really does hold up. The path forward for it is, yes, our current library, people might not necessarily be aware, but it is failing to serve residents in that it's smaller than what the demand would be. We've got conflicting uses, and as a building it's just not holding up, and we've seen that with its recent closure due to the earthquake strengthening required. But I think what we need to start with is going, well, what do people want to see in this precinct? What are the opportunities? And then going to, and how much would this cost? And obviously the location is another area with a big question mark. I've been pretty consistent in saying it's probably not worth the risk and the potential added cost of building in that location. So also looking at actually where can we place this to maximise its impact in the city as well.
And what do you think council's role is in generally revitalising the CBD? How do you see council's actions playing out there?
So we've got the wonderful Te Aroa Whakatū, our city centre spatial plan, and I think that plans like that, which are really evidence-based, are going to be key to bringing more people back into the city by making it a welcoming place where people don't only want to be there for the sort of transactional reasons, but actually as a place to stay and to linger, and then as a result to go, oh well, I guess it's time for another coffee, or maybe I'll pop in on my lunch break and make a few purchases. But just on making it a place that's centred for the people that actually use it. And so I'm someone who lives in the city centre, I get to experience it every day, and you can already see that where people tend to congregate other places that have a bit of liveliness, a bit of action, but also have reasons for them to stay around, whether it's just a comfortable seat that they can spend a little bit of time in. So those sorts of actions are really key, but also through that working with our local businesses who make up, you know, that key part of our city centre, and saying how can we make your businesses more successful, and what can we do that'll support you to thrive as well.
And thinking very specifically around sort of some of the compliance costs on businesses, would you support a review of the commercial rating and the differentials within that? Yeah,
absolutely. So we have been progressively reducing that differential. I think it's key that the way we rate is proportional to the delivery that people receive and to the resources that they're getting back from that. And it's safe to say that we've had decades of underinvestment in our city centre, and so it doesn't necessarily make sense that they're paying significantly more rates. You can't see that on the ground, and so I think that continuing to reduce that differential and reviewing it and saying, well, one, are you getting bang for your buck, but also should we be putting more bang into the city centre as well?
And just thinking about something sort of more adjacent to us, but do you think that it's confusing for people that we've got a different rating system to Tasman District Council, and do you think we should have the same one? And if so, which one?
I think we should have the same one, and I think that actually land value is the way to stay. When you look at both the progressiveness of the systems, land value tends to align more closely with incomes, but also when you look at the incentives that it provides, land value incentivises intensification and investment far more than a capital value rating system does. And so I think that it's actually the way to stay, and you're seeing around the country more of those conversations happening of going, we all accepted that capital value is the way to go, but it's not working out the way that a lot of people thought it would. So I think we should stick with what we've got. But it's also a conversation that needs to be had, and we've shied away from having it in past long-term plans, but I think the time's come to go, is this rating system working, and can we get that consistency across the board?
And so just moving on from that, do you support amalgamation between Nelson City and Tasman District?
I think in many ways it's sort of yesterday's question, in that we're seeing such scale of the reform to local government. Three Waters, the planning reforms and the RMA reforms, also the Future for Local Government review, is, I think, the actual solution is, it does not make sense for an urban area to be cut in half, but those concerns around rural voice, particularly for the sort of wider Tasman area, still exist. And so I don't think the solution is necessarily just wholesale amalgamation, but I do think that changes are needed to make particularly that Nelson-Richmond interface work a whole lot better and a whole lot more consistently.
You mentioned Three Waters. Clearly that's going to be a question. What is your position on Three Waters?
Look, it's clear that local governments across the country have failed to invest to the level we need. Nelson is, in some ways, an exception where we have got some high levels of investment, but the costs coming down the pipeline, excuse the pun, are very high. We know that Stoke, pretty much the whole Stoke area, is going to need replacements on its three water services. They're coming up to the end of their life, and that price tag is going to be too big for ratepayers to bear alone. How we work through that and manage that, and whether the reforms themselves are the right balance, I don't think they are yet. I'm concerned about the inclusion of stormwater particularly, which should be a whole of catchment approach. It shouldn't just be the pipes at the end. And so to me, there's a divide there, but also making sure that community voice and that democratic input continues to be there, as well as we've spent in the infrastructure committee, we did a whole rearrange to make sure that when we were thinking of putting transport upgrades in, we'd also look at doing three water upgrades to minimise disruption and vice versa. So how, if the reforms go ahead as they're planned, how will councils continue to interface their work in with these new entities? And then also you come to the, whether we should be grouped in with the North Island, which I don't think is necessarily the way to go either. So there's some good things in there, but we need to have the mature discussion on actually, what are we facing? And what's going to be the best way to get through that, which I don't think the reforms currently have landed on, but the fact that the government's actually paying attention and trying to do something is a good sign.
And I imagine the repair bill coming after the floods is probably going to do something that will focus the thinking around that. Yes,
exactly. And I think that that's another area where it highlights that you do still need local engagement, because those disruptions and that work should be done in partnership with our community.
And what is your position on having non-elected representatives on committees? I know there's been some discussion from some people who don't necessarily understand why council would do that, but to have expertise brought in, what is your position on that?
So for things like our Audit and Risk Committee, the Office of the Auditor General is very clear that it is a huge benefit to have an independent chair and to have independent expertise coming in there, and so that's something I absolutely support. The other appointees we have are iwi representation, which I think is incredibly important to, one, making good decisions and upholding the partnership that underpins this country. So I'm very supportive of that. I think that there still needs to be that accountability mechanism for our appointees, particularly the ones directly appointed by council, and that there should be that full transparency and review process there as well. But bringing in outside expertise is not a bad thing.
Could you sort of sum up in a very quick sentence what your leadership style around the council table would be?
I tend to try to be the last to speak. I like to hear what people have to say and try to find that pathway forward. I think that the divisiveness that we've seen has not delivered for our communities, and we actually need to have a collaborative while still having a clear direction. So my leadership style is really about bringing people together where we can agree, and acknowledging the areas where we can't, but still moving forward together.
And for some people looking at this, they might think that you probably haven't had much experience. You know, you're obviously young.
Yes.
Can't shy away from that. What would you say to people who would say that actually, you know, that's an issue?
My go-to is, you know, what do you want from your leadership? You know, there's always that talk of experience, but our city is made up of, you know, 50,000 people, each with very different experiences from one another. One person can't hold all of those experiences. So what we need in leadership is actually people who are willing to listen to experiences other than their own and bring them to the table and not go in thinking they've got the right answer. And I think I've got a track record that proves an ability to get things done, whilst also working closely with our community and bringing in those views and being willing to change my mind, which I think is actually something that's really crucial in leadership.